For 10 years, my son was a ghost. He wasn't dead, not in the way that brings flowers and sympathy cards. He was a different kind of ghost, the kind that lives in the empty spaces of a quiet house. He was in the extra chair at the dinner table that my wife Eleanor never cleared away. He was in the scent of sawdust that still lingered in my old workshop in the garage. He was in the silence that fell between us whenever a commercial for a family vacation came on the television. For a decade, Jamal was a name we learned not to speak a wound. We learned not to touch a ghost. We learned to live with. And then one Tuesday night, after 3,652 days of silence, his ghost decided to call. Our life in the suburbs of Atlanta had settled into the quiet rhythm of retirement, a rhythm of predictability, of safety. My days were spent in the garden, battling with the stubborn Georgia clay to bring forth roses and tomatoes. It was a simple fight, one I could understand and usually win. Eleanor spent her afternoons on the porch swing, lost in the pages of a book, her silver hair catching the golden light of the setting sun. We had created a fortress of routine around ourselves, a carefully constructed peace designed to keep the memories at bay. We spoke of the weather, of our neighbors, of the rising price of groceries. We spoke of everything and anything except the one thing that truly mattered. Photographs of Jamal were still on the mantelpiece, frozen in time. Jamal at his high school graduation, his smile wide and full of promise. Jamal at his wedding, handsome in his tuxedo, standing next to Tasha, the woman who had slowly, methodically, and completely erased us from his life. We never talked about taking them down. To remove them would be an admission of defeat, a final surrender. And so they stayed smiling ghosts in silver frames, silent witnesses to our silent grief. That night was like any other. A blanket of humidity had settled over the city. The only sounds were the chirp of crickets and the low hum of the air conditioner. Eleanor was asleep upstairs, her breathing soft and even. I was in my armchair, the television on mute, watching the flashing lights of a late-night news report paint patterns on the wall. The stillness was heavy, a familiar weight I had carried for years. Then it happened. A shrill, piercing sound shattered the silence. The telephone. It rarely rang this late, and my first thought was that something had happened to Eleanor's sister in Florida. I reached for it, my heart beginning a slow, heavy drumbeat against my ribs. But when I looked at the small screen, my breath caught in my throat. The world seemed to stop. All the air was sucked out of the room. It wasn't an unknown number. It wasn't a telemarketer. It wasn't a wrong number. It was a name. A name I had not seen on my phone in 10 years. A name that brought with it a tidal wave of love, anger, confusion, and a desperate, terrifying hope. Tasha. My hand trembled as it hovered over the phone. A decade of unanswered questions of holidays spent staring at the door of birthdays marked by a painful silence, all rushed back in a single overwhelming flood. Every instinct honed by years of rejection screamed at me to ignore it, to let it go to voicemail, to protect the fragile peace we had built, to protect my own heart from being broken one more time. But beneath the fear, a tiny, stubborn ember of a father's love still glowed. What if this was it? What if this was the call we had been waiting for? I looked up the stairs towards the room where my wife was sleeping, and I knew I couldn't live with the not knowing. With a deep breath that felt like a prayer, I pressed the green button. Dad. The voice on the other end was a ghost wrapped in static, a fragile, trembling thing that barely resembled the confident, dismissive tone I remembered. It was Tasha, but it was a version of her I had never heard before. She was crying, a raw, desperate sound that made the hairs on my arms stand up. Dad. Oh God. Is that you? I gripped the phone tighter, my knuckles turning white. Tasha. What's wrong? What's happened? I motioned for Eleanor to come closer, pressing the speaker button so she could hear. Her face was a canvas of confusion and alarm. It's Jamal. Tasha, sobbed her voice breaking. Something's happened. Something terrible. A cold dread, icy and sharp, pierced through the years of anger and resentment. At that moment, she wasn't the daughter-in-law who had stolen our son. She was just a voice telling me my child was in danger. Tell me, Tasha. Tell me what's wrong. He started a business. She began, the words tumbling out between panicked breaths. A tech company. It was supposed to be our big break, our way to finally have the life we dreamed of. But he needed capital more than the banks would give us. So he found a private investor. He was so sure, so confident. She let out a gut-wrenching sob. But they weren't investors, Dad. They were criminals. Loan sharks connected to a gang here in Los Angeles. Eleanor gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. This was already sounding wrong, like a plot from a bad television movie. My mind was screaming with red flags, but Eleanor's eyes were wide with pure terror. The business failed. Tasha continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. It all fell apart a few months ago. And now they want their money back. With interest. They want $75,000, Dad. 75,000, I repeated the number, feeling foreign and absurd. And we don't have it, she shrieked, the panic escalating. We don't have anything. And now, they have him. They have Jamal. The world tilted. Eleanor let out a small, wounded sound like an animal in pain. What do you mean they have him? I demanded, my voice low and urgent. They took him last night, Tasha cried. They sent me a picture. His face... Oh God, Marcus, his face was all bruised and swollen. They said if they don't get their money in cash by tomorrow night, they're going to hurt him. Really hurt him. They said I'd never see my husband again. Every rational thought in my head was at war with the primal terror of a father's love. 10 years of silence, and the first call is for a fortune. It made no sense. It was a scam. It had to be. But the image she painted, the picture of my son beaten and held captive, bypassed all my logic. It was a poison dart aimed directly at my heart. What do you want us to do? I asked, my voice hoarse. Eleanor was already nodding frantically, tears streaming down her face. We have to help him, Marcus. We have to, she whispered urgently. You're our only hope. Tasha pleaded, her voice a fragile thread. You have to bring the money. Cash in a duffel bag. They gave me specific instructions. You have to leave it in a dumpster behind an old diner just off the highway. I'll text you the address. It has to be tomorrow night, at 10 o'clock sharp, not a minute later, or they said the deal is off. Why not go to the police, Tasha? I asked the question, feeling foolish even as I said it. No, she screamed into the phone, the sound so sharp it made me flinch. No police. They told me, they swore to me, they're watching me. They're watching our house. They're watching my phone. They said if they see a single cop, if they even suspect anything, I'll be a widow by morning. Please, Dad, you have to promise me, no police. The trap was perfect. It preyed on our love, our fear, and it isolated us completely. It left us with no choice but to play her game. Eleanor was looking at me with eyes that begged me to agree to save our child, to erase the last 10 years of pain with one grand, heroic act. The doubts were still swirling in my mind, a toxic, confusing fog. But looking at my wife's desperate face, I knew my own skepticism didn't matter. Okay, Tasha, I said, the words feeling like stones in my mouth. We'll be there. We'll bring the money. A sound of profound relief came from the other end. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you, Dad. You're saving his life. You're saving your son. The line went dead, leaving only a dial tone humming in the heavy silence of our kitchen. The hum of the dial tone was the only sound in the room. It felt deafening. I stood frozen, the phone still pressed to my ear, the ghost of Tasha's voice echoing in my head. Eleanor stared at me, her eyes wide, her hands clasped together so tightly her knuckles were white. The silence stretched between us, thick with unspoken fear and a decade of pain. Finally, I lowered the phone. Eleanor. I began, my voice a low, gravelly thing. You cannot possibly believe that story. I believe our son is in trouble. She shot back, her voice trembling but firm. Think about it for a second. I pleaded, pacing the kitchen floor. 10 years, Eleanor. 10 years of nothing. Not a single phone call, not a Christmas card. He vanished. And now, out of the blue, his wife calls in the middle of the night asking for a fortune. It's a trick. It's a scam. It has to be. My words were a desperate attempt to build a wall of logic against the tide of emotion I knew was coming. What if it isn't? She asked, her gaze unwavering. What if this is the one time it's real? The story makes no sense. I insisted, my voice rising. Kidnapped by gangsters. A money drop in a dumpster. This isn't a movie. She's playing us, Eleanor. This is Tasha we are talking about, the woman who poisoned our son's mind against us. The woman who looked us in the eye at that last Thanksgiving dinner and told us we were no longer welcome. Why would we believe her now? Eleanor walked over to me and placed her hands on my arms. Her touch was soft, but her eyes were filled with a fire I had not seen in years. It was the fire of a mother protecting her young. "I don't trust her, Marcus," she said, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. "I will never trust her. I trust the terror I heard in her voice. And I trust the fact that somewhere in Los Angeles, our son might be hurt and alone, waiting for his parents to come for him." She took a deep breath, and her next words struck down all my defenses, every last one. "Let's say you're right," she said. "Let's say it's a 99% chance this is all a lie, a cruel trick to get our money. But Marcus, what about that 1%? What if there is just a 1% chance that she is telling the truth? Are you willing to bet our son's life on that? What if Jamal dies tonight alone and terrified, all because his father was too proud, too stubborn to risk being made a fool of one last time?" She looked deep into my eyes, her own filled with tears. "Is that a risk you are willing to take? Because I am not. I will not sit here in our safe, quiet house and do nothing. I will not let our son die because we were too scared to answer his call for help." Her words hit me with the force of a physical blow. She was right. My anger at Tasha, my wounded pride, none of it mattered. All that mattered was that tiny, terrifying sliver of a chance that our son needed us. I looked at the fierce, determined woman in front of me, the love of my life, and I saw a mother who would walk through fire for her child, and I knew I had to walk with her. I gave a single slow nod. The decision was made. A frantic energy filled the house. We threw clothes into a suitcase. I found an old duffel bag in the garage. And then came the worst part. We drove to the all-night ATM at the bank, and transaction by transaction we drained our life savings. The machine hummed and spat out $100 bills, each one representing a year of hard work, a dream of a comfortable retirement, a piece of our future. Now it was just a pile of paper, a ransom for a ghost. Back in the car, the bag of cash sat on the back seat. It felt heavier than any amount of money should. It was the weight of hope, the weight of fear, and the weight of a love that refused to die. The highway stretched out before us, a long black ribbon unfurling into the darkness. We drove for hours, the rhythmic thump of the tires on the pavement the only sound in the car. The $75,000 sat in the duffel bag on the back seat, a silent, heavy passenger that seemed to suck all the air out of the vehicle. Outside, America rolled by in a blur of city lights and dark, empty plains. Neither of us saw any of it. We were both trapped in a prison of our own thoughts, replaying the last 10 years over and over again. It was Eleanor who finally broke the silence. Her voice was small, almost lost in the noise of the road. "What do you think happened, Marcus? What really happened to our boy?" Her question was a key unlocking a door I had kept bolted shut for a decade. The memories came flooding back, not as a gentle stream, but as a violent, crashing wave. I saw Jamal not as the hardened man Tasha described, but as the bright-eyed 20-year-old in my workshop telling me he was dropping out of college. "It's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, Dad," he'd said, his face glowing with excitement. "Tasha knows these people in California. They're starting an online business. This is the future," I remember. The disappointment that felt like a physical blow. I had worked for 40 years at the Ford assembly plant, my hands calloused and scarred to give him the future I never had. A degree, a stable career, a life built on solid ground. "A future is built with your hands and your sweat, son," I'd told him, my voice sterner than I intended. Not with get-rich-quick schemes and internet fantasies. The light in his eyes had dimmed. "It's my future, Dad, not yours." He'd said, his voice quiet but sharp. "Maybe you just don't get it." He walked out of the workshop that day, and in a way he never came back. That was the beginning of the end, the day the wall between us started to be built brick by painful brick. I told Eleanor about that day, my voice thick with a regret so profound it felt like I was choking on it. She listened patiently, her hand resting on my arm. When I finished, she sighed a deep, weary sound. "I don't think it was just that one fight, Marcus. It was her. It was always her." Her words triggered her own cascade of memories. I could see them playing behind her eyes as she spoke. At their wedding, she began, "I thought she was wonderful. So charming, so full of life. I was so happy for him." But then the little things started. The missed Sunday dinners because they were networking with important people. The phone calls that went unreturned. I'd call to speak to Jamal, and she would always answer. "Oh, he's in a meeting, Eleanor. I'll have him call you back." He never did. Her voice grew quieter, filled with a distant pain. The last straw was Christmas, 6 months after they moved. We'd planned it for weeks. I cooked for 2 days. The whole house smelled like turkey and cinnamon. We waited and waited. 3 hours after they were supposed to arrive, I got a text message. She closed her eyes as if she could still see the words on the screen. It said, "So sorry, something came up, can't make it." Not a phone call, not even an excuse. Just that. I stood in the kitchen, surrounded by all that food, in a completely silent house. And I knew we had lost him. She had finally cut the last thread, and our son was gone. We drove on the silence in the car, now filled with the ghosts of our shared memories. We weren't just driving to save our son from a gang of criminals. We were driving to save him from a decade of mistakes, of words left unsaid, of a distance that had grown so vast it seemed impossible to cross. This insane, desperate mission was our one last chance to tear down the wall we had all helped to build. As the first faint glow of dawn appeared on the horizon, we saw a large green sign emerge from the darkness. It read, "Los Angeles 100 miles. The past was behind us. The terrifying, unknown future was waiting just down the road." The GPS voice, chipper and robotic, announced, "You have arrived." I slowed the car to a crawl, looking out the window at a street that seemed a world away from the glamorous Los Angeles I had imagined. The houses were small and tired, with peeling paint and chain-link fences. Cars sat rusting on cinder blocks in overgrown yards. This was a neighborhood of forgotten dreams, not a place where a successful tech entrepreneur would live. "This can't be it, Marcus." Eleanor whispered, her voice tight with disbelief. She was checking the address. Tasha had texted us for the 10th time. "It has to be a mistake." But it wasn't. We found the number painted in faded, flaking numbers on a dented mailbox that leaned precariously to one side. The house it belonged to was the worst one on the block. It looked less like a home and more like a wound. The lawn was a jungle of brown weeds and dead grass, choking the life out of a few pathetic, withered rose bushes. The paint had surrendered to the sun years ago, peeling away in long strips to reveal the gray, splintered wood beneath. Most of the windows were boarded up with mismatched pieces of plywood, and the ones that weren't were dark broken and gaping like the empty sockets of a skull. A profound sense of dread washed over me. The red flags that had been waving in the back of my mind were now screaming sirens. This was not the home of a man in need of a short-term loan. This was the home of a man whose life had completely fallen apart. We got out of the car. The duffel bag filled with our life savings now felt utterly absurd. I left it on the floor of the car, a useless pile of money in a place where hope had clearly died long ago. We walked up the cracked concrete path, the silence of the street broken only by the distant wail of a siren and the crunch of dead leaves under our feet. The front door was scarred and weathered, the wood warped and split. I knocked and the sound was hollow, swallowed by the emptiness inside. We waited. Nothing. I knocked again, harder this time, my knuckles rapping against the splintered wood. Still only silence answered. A cold knot of fear tightened in my gut. On a desperate whim, I reached out and turned the doorknob. It wasn't locked. The door swung inward with a low, mournful groan, opening into a dark, cavernous space. The air that rushed out to meet us was stale and thick with the smell of dust, mildew, and abandonment. We stepped inside, our eyes struggling to adjust to the gloom. The inside was even worse than the outside. A thick carpet of gray dust covered every surface. Cobwebs thick as cotton hung from the ceilings like macabre decorations. The only piece of furniture was a single wooden chair overturned in the middle of the room as if thrown in anger. The floor was littered with old yellowed newspapers and junk mail. This wasn't a home. It was a tomb filled with the ghosts of 1,000 unanswered questions. Eleanor's hand found mine and gripped it tightly. Her knuckles were cold. Then I saw it. Taped to the inside of a grimy window was a piece of paper, an official-looking document with bold black letters. I walked over and carefully peeled it from the glass. It was a notice of foreclosure from the Bank of America. It was dated 2 years ago, and at the bottom, printed in clear, undeniable type, were the names of the property owners, Jamal Washington and Tasha Roberts Washington. The paper trembled in my hand. So this was the truth, or at least a piece of it. There was no successful business. There was no beautiful home. There was only this hollowed-out shell, this monument to failure and decay. My son had lost everything, and he had been too ashamed to tell us. The lie was exposed, but the truth felt even colder and more terrifying. We were standing in the wreckage of our son's life, and we were no closer to finding him. The only thing we knew for sure was that the story about the gangsters was a complete fabrication, which meant the real reason he needed $75,000 was something far, far worse. We stumbled out of the derelict house and back into the harsh California sunlight, the foreclosure notice clutched in my hand like a death certificate. The world felt tilted unreal. Eleanor was pale, leaning against me for support. We were adrift in a sea of lies with no land in sight. What kind of trouble was our son in? Where was he? The questions swirled in my head, a confusing, sickening vortex. That's when the screen door of the house next door creaked open. An elderly man stepped out onto his porch. He was tall and thin, with skin the color of rich coffee and a crown of white hair. He moved slowly, methodically, picking up a green watering can to tend to a row of bright red geraniums. But his eyes, sharp and intelligent, were fixed on us. He watched us for a long moment before speaking, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that carried across the lawn. "You folks lost nothing for you here. This house has been empty for years." His tone wasn't friendly. It was the guarded, weary tone of a man who had seen too much trouble in his neighborhood and wanted no part of it. I took a hesitant step toward his fence. "Sir, we're not lost. We're looking for the people who used to live here. Jamal and Tasha Washington. Do you know them?" The man put his watering can down and his eyes narrowed into suspicious slits. "Depends on who's asking," he said slowly. "You with his crew? You friends of his?" The accusation hung in the air, sharp and ugly. He thought we were criminals, associates of our own son. Eleanor flinched as if she'd been struck. I raised my hands in a gesture of peace, my heart aching with a shame so profound it was a physical pain. "No, sir," I said, my voice cracking. "We're not his friends. I'm his father. My name is Marcus Washington. This is his mother, Eleanor." I felt a desperate need for him to believe me, to see the truth in our faces. "We haven't seen our son in 10 years. We got a call last night. We thought he was in trouble. We drove all the way from Atlanta to help him." The old man's expression shifted. The hard suspicion in his eyes softened, replaced by a look of deep, profound pity. He let out a long, slow sigh, the sound of a man burdened by a story he didn't want to tell. He gestured with his head toward the steps of his immaculately kept porch. "You'd better come sit down," he said gently. His name was Mr. Henderson. We sat on the steps, and the truth when it came was far worse than anything we could have imagined. "I remember your boy when he first moved in." Mr. Henderson began, his gaze distant. Seemed like a nice kid, ambitious, always talking about his new business. But that wife of his, she had a hunger in her eyes I never did trust. He shook his head. "There was no tech company, Mr. Washington. The business was cars, expensive cars, coming and going at all hours of the night, people I'd never seen before with eyes just as hungry as hers. It didn't take a genius to figure out something was very, very wrong." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "Then one morning about 8 years ago, I woke up to sirens. The whole street was filled with black vans and men in jackets that said FBI. It was a raid. They used a battering ram on that door you just walked through. I saw them bring Jamal and Tasha out in handcuffs. The whole neighborhood was on their lawns just watching." He looked at me, his eyes full of a sad kindness. He was about to deliver the final blow, and he knew it. It was all over the news. They were part of a huge drug trafficking ring, moving narcotics from the border up to the cities. The feds had been watching them for months. "Your son, he wasn't just involved, he was one of the ringleaders." He took a deep breath. "Jamal got 12 years in federal prison. His wife Tasha, she got 10. The world went silent. The sounds of the street, the chirping of birds, the distant traffic, it all faded away into a dull roar. The foreclosure notice, the lies about gangsters. It all clicked into place, forming a picture of a life so horrifically different from the one we knew. Our son was not a victim. He was a felon, a drug trafficker, sitting in a federal prison. The hammer of truth had fallen, and our world, the world we thought we knew, was shattered into a million unrecognizable pieces. The drive to Victorville was a silent pilgrimage into the heart of the desert. The landscape outside was barren and unforgiving, a panorama of sand and rock baking under a relentless sun. Then it appeared on the horizon, a low, sprawling complex of concrete and razor wire shimmering in the heat. It didn't look like a building. It looked like a scar on the face of the earth. The Federal Correctional Institution, a place I had only ever seen in movies and now a place that held my son. The process of entering this fortress was designed to strip you of your humanity piece by piece. It began at the first gate with a guard whose eyes were as flat and empty as the desert around us. He took our IDs without a word, his expression a mixture of boredom and suspicion. We were not grieving parents in his eyes. We were a potential problem, a disruption to his routine. The visitors' lobby was cold despite the blistering heat outside. The air smelled of bleach and a faint underlying scent of human sadness. The chairs were hard plastic bolted to the floor. Everything was gray. The walls, the floor, the counter behind which another guard sat protected by a thick wall of bulletproof glass. We were on one side of the glass, the world of the living. Our son was on the other. They called our names and the methodical process of erasure began. We had to empty our pockets and place everything into a small gray locker. My wallet, my keys, the small worn photo of a smiling little boy that I've carried for 40 years. Eleanor had to remove her simple gold wedding band, the one she hadn't taken off in nearly 50 years. She looked at her bare hand as if it belonged to a stranger. We were being rendered anonymous, stripped of our pasts, made ready to enter a world where we had no identity other than visitor. We walked through a metal detector. It let out a loud, angry buzz as Eleanor passed through. A female guard sighed with practiced annoyance. Eleanor had forgotten a small decorative pin on her collar. Her hands trembled as she fumbled to remove it. I could see a flush of shame creep up her neck. It was a small humiliation, but it was part of the process. It was designed to make you feel powerless, to remind you that you were entering a place where you had no control. Then came the pat-down. A male guard ran his hands over my arms, my chest, my legs, his touch firm and impersonal. Another guard did the same to Eleanor. We were no longer Marcus and Eleanor Washington from Atlanta, Georgia. We were just bodies to be searched, vessels that might be carrying contraband. Once we were cleared, a tall, silent guard led us from the lobby into the prison itself. And with every step, the world we knew fell further and further away. We walked through a series of long concrete hallways, our footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. The only sound was the constant deafening slam of heavy iron gates. A gate would slide open before us, and as soon as we passed through, it would slam shut behind us with a sound of absolute finality. A sound that said there is no going back. The walls were bare concrete. The lights were harsh fluorescent tubes that cast everything in a sickly greenish glow. This was a maze built of despair. As I walked, my mind kept flashing back to Jamal's childhood bedroom. The bright blue walls, the superhero posters, the shelf overflowing with baseball trophies, the smell of clean laundry. How did he get from there to here? How did my son, my bright, funny, full of life, son end up in a place so completely devoid of color, of hope, of life itself? The cold, hard concrete beneath my feet was no different from the wall that had stood between us for the last 10 years. And now I had to find a way to break through both. The guard led us to a small booth at the end of the visiting room. It was a tiny claustrophobic space with 2 plastic stools, a small counter, and a thick pane of smudged bulletproof glass. On the other side of the glass was an identical booth. A black telephone receiver hung on the wall on both sides. This was how we would speak to our son, not with hugs or handshakes, but through a piece of plastic separated by a wall of impenetrable glass. We sat and waited. The minutes stretched into an eternity. Eleanor wrung her hands in her lap, her knuckles white. I stared at the empty stool opposite us, my heart pounding a heavy, painful rhythm against my ribs. What would he look like? What would we say? How do you condense 10 years of silence into a 30-minute visit? A heavy door buzzed open and he walked in. My first thought was, that's not him. This man was a stranger. My son. The Jamal I remembered was full of life and easy laughter. This man was a ghost carved from stone. He was wearing a drab khaki prison jumpsuit that hung loosely on his thin frame. His face was gaunt with sharp cheekbones and dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and a deep, abiding weariness. A crude, dark tattoo of a coiled serpent crept up the side of his neck from beneath his collar, but it was his eyes that truly broke my heart. They were my son's eyes, the same deep brown I'd looked into 1,000 times, but they were flat, hard, and filled with a cold, simmering rage. He moved with a stiff, defensive posture as if expecting a blow. He sat down heavily on the stool, his movements jerky and angry. He picked up the telephone receiver but didn't look at us. He stared at a point on the wall just over my head. The silence was deafening. Eleanor picked up her receiver, her hand trembling. "Jamal," she whispered, her voice choked with tears. "Oh, baby, it's you." He finally turned his eyes on us, and the sheer force of his hatred felt like a physical blow. He wasn't looking at his parents. He was looking at his accusers, his jailers, his betrayers. So he set his voice a low, dangerous growl that I didn't recognize. "You finally decided to show up." Before I could even form a response, the dam of his resentment broke and a decade of pain came pouring out in a toxic, unstoppable flood. "What did you get curious?" He spat into the phone, his words dripping with venom. "Decided to take a little trip to the zoo to see the family failure in his cage 10 years. For 10 whole years I sat in this hole waiting. The first year I thought maybe you'd call. The second year I thought maybe you'd write. By the third year I finally understood. Nothing." "Jamal, no, that's not true." Eleanor sobbed, but her words were just noise to him. He ignored her completely, his burning gaze fixed on me. "Tasha told me everything. She told me how ashamed you were. Your son, the drug dealer. Can't have that sullying the great Washington family name, can you? It was easier for you to just pretend I didn't exist, to tell all your friends in Atlanta that I was dead. We never said that." I said, my own voice rising a mixture of shock and anger. "We would never, liar!" he roared, and his voice, amplified and distorted by the cheap phone receiver, was a sound of pure agony. She told me how you two sat at your kitchen table and decided that I was a disgrace you couldn't bear, that you were cutting me off, for good." He leaned forward, his face just inches from the glass. I could see every line of pain etched around his eyes. "I wrote you," he said, his voice dropping to a raw, trembling whisper that was somehow more terrifying than his yelling. "Did you know that my first year in here, when I still thought you were my parents, I wrote you a letter every single week? I poured my whole soul onto those pages. I told you how sorry I was. I told you how I messed up, how I let you down, how I let myself down. I begged you to just write me back, just one letter, just to tell me that you still loved your son." His eyes were glistening now with tears of pure, unadulterated rage. "Tasha told me what you did. She said you sent them all back, every single one, stamped with return to sender. She said you told her to tell me that I wasn't your son anymore, that as far as you were concerned, your son died the day he got arrested." Then he drew back his hand and slammed it against the thick glass partition. The sound was a dull, sickening thud that made both of us jump. "Do you have any idea what that feels like?" He screamed, his face contorted in a mask of agony. "To be in hell and to know that your own mother and father are the ones who locked the door and threw away the key." Eleanor was inconsolable, her sobs shaking her entire body. I was speechless, paralyzed by the sheer horror of the lie he had been living. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a complete, surgically precise assassination of our character. Tasha hadn't just built a wall, she had poisoned the very ground on both sides, ensuring nothing could ever grow between us again. Jamal saw our shock, our tears, and he took it as a confirmation of his story. He thought he was looking at the faces of guilty people. He let out a short, bitter laugh. "Save it," he spit. "Save your tears. It's about 10 years too late for that. You made your choice. Now you get to look at what you created." He stared at us for one more long, hateful moment, then he slammed the receiver back onto its cradle, stood up and walked out without a backward glance, leaving us alone in the suffocating silence on our side of the glass. Jamal slammed the phone down and walked away, his back rigid with a decade of manufactured hatred. My heart shattered. Eleanor's sobs were the only sound in our tiny booth. It was over. We had failed. But as he reached the door, I did the only thing I could. I yelled into the receiver, my voice raw with a father's desperation, hoping he could still hear me through the glass. "She called us, Jamal. Your wife called us last night." He stopped. For a long second, he stood with his back to us, his shoulders tense. Then slowly, agonizingly, he turned around and walked back to the booth. He didn't sit. He stood looming over the stool and picked up the receiver, his eyes daring me to continue. I took a deep breath, pushing down my own pain and forcing a calm I did not feel. My anger was useless here. Only the cold, hard truth could penetrate the armor he had built around himself. "She called us last night," I repeated, my voice steady and clear. "For the first time in 10 years. She was crying, Jamal. Crying and screaming that you were in terrible trouble." "What are you talking about?" he sneered, but there was a flicker of confusion in his eyes now. "I'm in here. What trouble could I be in?" "That's a good question," I said, holding his gaze. "According to Tasha, a business deal of yours went bad. She said you had borrowed money from some very dangerous people, a gang here in Los Angeles. She said they were holding you captive. She said they had hurt you." I let the details hang in the air. Eleanor had stopped crying and was now listening, her eyes fixed on Jamal's face, searching for any sign of recognition. Jamal just stared at me, his expression a mask of disbelief. "That's insane. You're lying. Why would you make up something so crazy? I'm not the one who made it up, son. She did. She told us that these gangsters were demanding $75,000 in cash, or they were going to kill you." Jamal's sneer faltered. He blinked, the first crack appearing in his wall of certainty. The amount of money was a direct hit. I saw it in his eyes. He knew that number. $75,000, Jamal. I pressed on my voice like a surgeon's scalpel cutting away at the lies. A very specific number. "Does that number mean anything to you? Is that, for example, the amount a person might need to hire a top-tier appeals lawyer to try and get their sentence reduced?" He flinched. The color drained from his face. He knew. "She never told you, did she?" I continued, my voice quiet, but relentless. "She never told you about her brilliant plan. She was going to use our love for you, the same love she spent 10 years telling you didn't exist, to scam your mother and me out of our entire life savings." I told him everything then. I told him about the frantic drive from Atlanta. I told him about the derelict, foreclosed house she sent us to. I described the dust, the emptiness, the notice from the bank with their names on it. I told him about his old neighbor, Mr. Henderson, and the pity in his eyes as he told us the real story. The story about the FBI raid, the drug trafficking, and the prison sentences. As I spoke, I watched a decade of anger drain out of my son's face, replaced by a wave of dawning, sickening horror. The hard defensive lines of his posture softened and then collapsed. He sank onto the stool, the phone receiver held loosely to his ear, his eyes wide and unfocused, as the pieces of his life rearranged themselves into a new and terrible picture. He was seeing it all now, all the little inconsistencies, all the times Tasha had told him one thing while her actions suggested another. He wasn't the son abandoned by his parents. He was the husband who had been isolated and controlled by his wife. His righteous anger, the fuel that had kept him going for 10 years in this place, had all been a lie. It was a weapon she had crafted and aimed for him, and he had wielded it with brutal efficiency against the two people in the world who had never stopped loving him. He looked up at us through the thick glass. The rage was gone. All that was left was a pain so deep and so raw it was almost unbearable to witness. A single tear escaped his eye and traced a path through the grime of his hardened face. Then another. He brought his free hand up to the glass, his fingers spreading flat against the cold surface. "Dad," he whispered, his voice, the broken sound of a little boy who was lost. "The letters. I really wrote them. I swear I did. I know you did, son." I said, my own tears finally falling. I raised my own hand to the glass, placing my palm directly over his. "I know." The glass between us was as thick and as cold as ever. But for the first time in a decade, there was nothing separating us. We walked out of the prison in a daze. The journey back through the concrete maze was a blur. The slamming of the iron gates, the cold eyes of the guards, the sterile smell of the lobby, it all passed without notice. My mind was still in that visiting booth, my hand still pressed against the glass, my son's heartbroken whisper still echoing in my ears. We retrieved our belongings from the locker. Eleanor slipped her wedding ring back onto her finger, the familiar gold band now feeling like an anchor in a world that had been turned completely upside down. We didn't speak as we walked out of the main entrance and into the blinding desert sun. The heat felt oppressive, suffocating. We got into the car, the same car that had carried us across the country on a wave of desperate hope. Now it felt like a funeral car. It was a vessel for our shared grief. I started the engine, but I didn't drive. I just sat there, my hands gripping the steering wheel, staring blankly through the windshield at the monstrous concrete fortress that held our son. For a long time, the only sound was the quiet hum of the engine and the soft whisper of the air conditioning. Words felt useless, inadequate to contain the sheer magnitude of what we had just learned. What could we possibly say? Our son's life had been a lie. His marriage was a prison built on top of the real one. His spirit had been systematically broken by the one person he trusted most. It was Eleanor who finally broke the silence. Her voice was a fragile thing, barely a whisper. All those years, Marcus, she said, her gaze lost somewhere in the distance. All those years he thought we hated him. He woke up every morning and went to sleep every night believing his own mother and father had thrown him away. I had no comfort to offer, no easy words to soothe a wound so deep. All I had was the shared truth of our pain. I know I said, my voice thick with unshed tears. I reached across the console and took her hand. Her skin was cold, but her grip was strong. We held on to each other, two people adrift on a terrible ocean, our shared touch, the only lifeline we had. What now? The original mission. The frantic drop of money to save our son from imaginary gangsters was a ghost. Our son was locked away for 2 more years. Our daughter-in-law was a monster, and we were 2,000 miles from home, sitting in a rental car in the middle of the California desert with our life savings in a duffel bag on the back seat. We were completely and utterly lost. But as we sat there in that heavy, heartbreaking silence, I knew one thing for sure. We were lost together. Tasha had tried to destroy our family, to tear us apart with her poison. But she had failed. In the wreckage of her lies, in the epicenter of our shared grief, all she had managed to do was remind us that all we ever truly had was each other. I squeezed Eleanor's hand, and she squeezed back. And for now, that was enough. We sat in the car, wrapped in a blanket of shared grief, the silence between us heavier than any words. Suddenly, the quiet was shattered by the ringing of my phone. The sound was violent, intrusive. I looked at the screen, and a cold, hard anger began to burn away the edges of my sorrow. It was her. It was Tasha. Eleanor looked at me, her eyes asking a silent question. I gave her a small nod, a promise. This time would be different. A new strength forged in the fires of the truth I had just learned settled over me. There was no hesitation. I was no longer a desperate father chasing a ghost. I was a man who knew the truth, and I was about to use it as a weapon. I answered the phone and put it on speaker. "Hello, Tasha," I said. My voice was calm, steady, and completely devoid of the panic she was expecting. Her voice, on the other hand, was a perfect performance of manufactured anxiety and sweetness. "Dad, oh, thank God you answered. I've been calling and calling. I was getting so worried. Did you get to the house? Is everything okay? Where are you? You have to hurry. Do you have the money? The deadline is getting close. We don't have much time." She was speaking quickly, trying to create a sense of urgency, trying to keep us trapped in her web of panic. I let her finish, letting her frantic questions hang in the air. Then I spoke, my voice low and dangerously quiet. "We just came from Victorville, Tasha." There was a moment of pure, confused silence on the other end. "Victorville," she repeated, her voice losing some of its frantic edge. "What are you talking about? Dad, this is no time for games. Jamal's life is on the line. Just tell me where you are." "It's a federal prison, Tasha," I said, my voice hardening, each word a carefully placed stone. "A very large one out in the middle of the desert. We were just visiting our son." I let the words sink in before I delivered the next blow. We had a long talk. A very enlightening talk. The silence on the other end was different now. It was the frozen, terrified silence of an animal that has just realized it has stepped into a trap. What did you do?" she stammered, the sweetness in her voice curdling into sharp, panicked anger. "You foolish old man, what did you say to him?" "The truth," I said simply. I told him the truth. We talked about the last 10 years, Tasha. We talked about the letters he wrote you every week from his cell, the ones you told him we sent back stamped, "Return to sender." "You're lying," she hissed, but her voice was thin, brittle. "Am I?" I continued, my own voice never rising, never breaking its cold, methodical rhythm. "We talked about how you told him we were ashamed of him, how you told him we had disowned him and told all our friends he was dead. We talked about the wall you so carefully built between a boy and his parents. He's my husband." "You have no right," she shrieked. And then I said, ignoring her completely, "We talked about your phone call from last night, the one about the gangsters, the one about the $75,000. I paused, letting her feel the full weight of her exposure. He found that part particularly interesting. The game was over. She knew it. Her mask of civility shattered, and the true monster beneath was revealed. "You have ruined everything," she screamed, her voice a torrent of pure venom. "You have no idea what you have just done. You think you've won. He is still in here with me. I'm still his wife. There are ways to get things done in a place like this. You want to keep him safe. You will bring me that money. You will bring it right now, or I swear to you he will have an accident before the week is over. It was her last, desperate move, a threat made from a position of absolute weakness, and we both knew it. I let out a short, cold laugh. Your threats are as empty as your promises, Tasha. Your control over our son is gone. We know the truth. And more importantly, he knows the truth. He knows you used him. He knows you isolated him. He knows you lied to him every single day for 10 years. He knows you tried to steal his parents' life savings. As far as he is concerned, Tasha, you no longer exist. I could hear her screaming on the other end, a stream of incoherent rage and desperate pleas. I didn't listen. I was looking at Eleanor. A single tear was tracing a path down her cheek, but for the first time in a very long time, it was not a tear of sadness. It was a tear of relief. I ended the call, and the monster's voice was gone, replaced by a profound and cleansing silence. The war was over, and we had won. Tasha was still screaming on the other end of the line, a torrent of desperate threats and pathetic last-minute pleas. Her words were meaningless noise, the frantic buzzing of an insect trapped in a jar. Her power was gone. The world she had built from lies had crumbled to dust, and she was buried in the rubble. I listened for a moment to the sound of her self-destruction, my heart feeling nothing but a cold, vast emptiness. Eleanor looked at me, her eyes clear, her expression calm. We were united in this. We were done. I waited for her to take a breath, for a brief pause in her tirade, and then I spoke. My voice was quiet, devoid of anger or hatred. It was simply the voice of finality. Listen to me very carefully, Tasha, I said. This is the last time you will ever hear my voice. Her screaming stopped, replaced by a strained, listening silence. Jamal has 2 more years to serve on his sentence. I continued, stating each word as an undeniable fact. And his mother and I, we will be here for him. We will visit him. We will write to him. And we will be waiting for him on the day he walks out of that gate a free man. I paused, letting her absorb the image of a future she would have no part in. As for you, I said, my voice dropping, enjoy your last 2 years in prison. When you get out, do not try to find us. Do not try to contact him. You are a ghost to us now. Never ever show your face in our lives again. Before she could utter another word, I pressed the red button on the screen, ending the call. The silence that filled the car was immediate and profound. Then with deliberate, steady fingers, I opened my contacts, found her name, and pressed the option to block the number. A simple, modern-day exorcism. The nightmare was over. The monster had been banished. There was no feeling of triumph, no sweet taste of revenge. There was only a heavy, bone-deep exhaustion and the immense, crushing sadness for all the years that had been stolen. I looked at Eleanor, and in her eyes, I saw my own grief reflected back at me. The final cut had been made. It was clean. It was necessary. And it hurt more than I ever could have imagined. I turned to Eleanor in the quiet car, the prison, a gray monument to our pain in the rearview mirror. We're not going back to Atlanta, I said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. Not yet. She simply nodded, a silent agreement passing between us. Our home was no longer a house in Georgia. Our home was wherever our son needed us to be. That week, we found a small, furnished one-bedroom apartment in a quiet town 15 miles from Victorville. It was a sterile, impersonal place with beige walls and generic furniture, a world away from the warmth and memories of our real home. But it had one crucial feature: it was close. Its sole purpose was to be our base of operations in the long, slow campaign to win our son back. And so our 2-year vigil began. The weekly visits became the new rhythm of our lives. At first they were painfully awkward. The thick glass was still between us, a constant reminder of the barriers we had to overcome. We struggled to find things to say, the chasm of 10 lost years stretching between us. We talked about the weather, about the terrible food in the prison cafeteria, about a new book Eleanor was reading. We were like strangers on a first date, carefully exploring the edges of each other's new reality. But slowly, painstakingly, the walls began to come down. We started talking about the past, not with anger, but with a sad, gentle honesty. And we started writing letters. Not the imagined, poisoned letters of Tasha's lies, but real ones. Jamal wrote to us every week, his handwriting tight and controlled. In those letters, he told us everything. He wrote about his addiction, a demon he had hidden from us for years. He wrote about the allure of fast money, about the deep insecurities that had made him so susceptible to Tasha's control. He wrote about his shame, his regret, his profound sorrow for the pain he had caused. In one letter, he wrote something I will never forget. For 10 years, my anger at you was the only thing I had. It was a shield. Now I realize I wasn't using it to protect myself from you. I was using it to hide my own shame from myself. It's a heavy thing to put down, but I'm trying. In return, we wrote back. We told him about our lives, about the quiet sadness that had filled our home. We told him about our forgiveness, a forgiveness that was not a single act but a daily choice. We told him over and over again in 100 different ways that we loved him, that we had never stopped loving him. The letters became a bridge, a fragile handwritten structure built across the chasm of our lost years, allowing our hearts to cross back to each other. The scheduled phone calls became bright spots in our quiet weeks. We began to hear the old Jamal in his voice again, a flicker of his old humor, a hint of his old curiosity. He told us about the recovery programs he was in, about the classes he was taking to finally get his degree. He was working. He was fighting. For the first time in a decade, we heard hope in his voice. The 2 years passed not as a blur, but as a series of deliberate, meaningful moments. Each visit, each letter, each phone call was a single stone being placed in a new foundation. A foundation built not on the shifting sands of ambition and lies, but on the solid rock of truth, forgiveness, and a love that had been tested and had against all odds endured. On our final visit just 1 week before his scheduled release, the conversation was easy, natural. We didn't talk about the past. We talked about the future. We talked about the old workshop in the garage, about Sunday dinners, about the simple, beautiful life that was waiting for him. The glass wall was still there, but it was invisible to us now. We were a family again, and we were ready to go home. The day finally came. 2 years to the day after our first visit, Eleanor and I sat in our car parked across the street from the main gate of the prison. It was early morning, the desert air still cool, the sun a pale white disk on the horizon. The light was different today. It was the light of a new beginning. We didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. We had done the work, we had rebuilt the bridge. We were simply here to bring our son home. At precisely 8 o'clock, a small steel door set into the massive concrete wall creaked open. A figure stepped out into the morning light, squinting. It was Jamal. He was no longer wearing the khaki uniform of a prisoner, but a simple pair of jeans and a gray shirt we had sent him. He carried a small cardboard box with his belongings. He looked thin and older than his years, but as he took a deep breath of the free air, a decade of hardness seemed to fall away from his shoulders. He saw our car and began to walk towards us, his steps steady and deliberate. The movies get these moments wrong. There was no dramatic slow-motion run. There were no tears, no shouting. The deep emotional reunion had already happened week by week, letter by letter over the past 2 years. This was not a reunion. This was a homecoming. I got out of the car and stood by the door waiting for him. He stopped a few feet in front of me. We looked at each other, and in that long, silent moment, everything was said. I'm sorry. I forgive you. I love you. Welcome back. I gave him a single firm nod. He nodded back, a small, genuine smile finally touching his lips. It was enough. He got into the back seat. Eleanor turned around from the passenger side, her hand on her heart. She didn't say a word, but tears of quiet joy traced paths down her cheeks. He looked at his mother and smiled that same small, true smile. I started the car and pulled away from the curb, leaving the concrete fortress and its ghosts in our rearview mirror. The journey home was a quiet one. Jamal just looked out the window, not at the prison disappearing behind us, but at the wide open road ahead. And I understood then that true freedom wasn't just about walking out of a gate. It was the quiet, profound decision to leave the prison of your past behind. The anger, the shame, the regret. Our son was finally free, and so were we. 6 months later, the autumn chill had settled over Atlanta, and our lives had found a new, beautiful rhythm. My old workshop in the garage, once a place of lonely silence, was now filled with the familiar sounds of creation again. The scent of sawdust and wood oil hung in the air, a perfume of healing and hard work. Jamal was there with me, standing at the workbench where I had once taught him to build a pine wood derby car. He was focused, his movements patient and sure as he carefully sanded the lid of a small, intricately carved wooden box. The past 6 months had transformed him. He had a steady job with a local construction crew where he was respected for his skill and his work ethic. He went to his recovery meetings 3 times a week without fail, drawing strength from the shared stories of others who were rebuilding their lives from the rubble. He had his own small apartment, but our dinner table was no longer missing its third chair. Every Sunday he came for dinner, filling our home with a quiet warmth that had been absent for so long. I watched him for a moment, my heart full. "That was your grandfather's, wasn't it?" I asked, gesturing to the box. "He made that for you the year you were born. I thought it was lost." Jamal looked up, a sad smile on his face. "I found it in the attic. It was in pretty bad shape. The lid was cracked and one of the hinges was broken. I almost threw it away." He ran his hand over the smooth, restored wood. "But I decided it was worth saving." He looked at me, then his eyes clear and full of a wisdom that had been earned in the darkest of places. "You know, Dad," he said softly, "I've realized something doing this. Fixing something that's broken, something that has history, is a lot harder than just making something new from scratch. It takes more patience, more care. You have to respect the scars, work around the damage, but in the end, it's worth so much more." We both knew he wasn't just talking about the box, he was talking about his life, he was talking about our family. I walked over and placed my hand on his shoulder. It was strong and steady beneath my palm. "Your grandfather would be proud, son," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I'm proud." He looked up at me, and in his eyes I saw not a stranger, not a ghost, but my son, whole and healed. He nodded, and we returned to our work side by side in the quiet comfort of the workshop. The silence between us was no longer a space of absence and pain, but a space of peace, understanding, and a love that had been broken and beautifully, painstakingly put back together again. Trust is a sacred gift, easily shattered by deceit, but powerful enough to be rebuilt through truth, forgiveness, and the patient work of love. The deepest wounds are not a life sentence. They are the starting point for a stronger foundation if we have the courage to build again.